So the thing about photographing in the mountains is that you get the very best view of the mountains when you're up amongst the mountains in the peaks themselves. So we've come here to Lagazoy, to the top of Lagazoy. It's about 2,700 meters to try and get an image of the surrounding peaks. But the other thing about photographing in the mountains is that the weather is pretty unpredictable and can be pretty extreme. So it's about, I don't know, about -9 out here, and you can see there's a lot of wind blowing. It's blowing a lot of storm, a lot of snow through, and we really don't have very good visibility. So the light's great. The sun's just come up. There's some really nice kind of orange colors, but unfortunately we just can't take an image because there's just too much stuff, too much snow between us and what we're trying to photograph. So we're going to try again tonight, and if that doesn't work, we're going to try again tomorrow morning. But hopefully, while here, going to get an image because this is a really, really beautiful place. Right, so back again, sunset now. Conditions are a little bit less challenging. The wind's lowered a lot because this morning it was pretty much impossible to shoot. We couldn't even focus. There was so much snow between the camera and the mountains that we were trying to shoot. The cameras were missing focus. We couldn't focus manually because we could barely see what we're shooting, but I think we managed to get a shot. Still, conditions are better now, except we've got absolutely no clouds, so no clouds at all. So what I'm going to try and do is just play around with the light and shadow. I've got a telephoto lens on, so I'm going to be looking at these peaks over here, looking at where the light hits them just as it goes down over there behind Marmolada, and hopefully it's going to just pick out some of the peaks. We're going to get these kind of contrasts, and I'm going to be zooming in with the telephoto and just picking out certain small parts of the scene and making abstracts. And because I quite like this stretch along here, what I think I'm going to try and do is shoot a panorama, so we'll see how that gets on. So what I'm going to do, because I'm going to shoot this in a pano, I'm going to put the camera in portrait mode and shoot it as a portrait panel using an L bracket for this. Now, L brackets are really good because they allow you to keep the camera centered on the tripod. They don't unbalance like they do, like a bore head would if you tilt the camera over. So the first thing to do when you're shooting a pano is to put the camera in manual. Each one of the frames should be the same exposure. So you move the camera around, basically going all the way across all the different frames that you're going to have, making sure that there's an exposure that captures all of the highlights and all of the shadows. Because if you leave the camera set on auto, what's going to happen is as you move the camera across the scene, you're going to get changes in exposure, which are really going to be noticeable when you try to stitch the panel together. The sky's going to be different, kind of things like that. Same's true for white balance, because some parts of the scene are bluer or warmer than others. The white balance will change to compensate. So keep the white balance also set to manual. So the thing about shooting panos is that you have to make sure, first of all, that you've got everything in the shot. So you pan the camera across like that, just making sure everything fits in. This mountain, that one there, is a little bit too close to the top. So I'm just gonna pull the camera back a little bit and then try again. So we're starting about here, going all the way across to there, and yeah, so that's everything. And the final thing about panos is make sure you've got plenty of overlap in each image. I usually like to do it with about 1/3 to 1/2 of the frame. So how that would work here is, and make sure you've got plenty at the edge. So we start here, and that's about 1/3 of the frame. So about there. Next shot starts there, and then about 1/3 of a frame is there. So we go to about there. That's the next shot. Then about 1/3 of a frame is this peak here. Go to that there, and then here. Next one be there. I think that's going to be the last one, but I'm going to put another one on the edge just to make sure it's about there. It's always better to have too much than not enough. All right, so that's probably it. Now I'm just going to shoot the shot and then see how it comes out. The light is really nice. It's probably got a little bit more to go because it's I think about 10 minutes before the sun's going to go below the horizon, maybe 5 minutes, and I'm hoping that these will get really warm and really, really red. And really pick up some color, because we don't have any interest in the sky, so really this is all about the light. Now let's have a look about how I would go about editing these kind of images. So this is one of the images that I took. It's not a panorama, you can see it's just one image taken just as the sun was going down. And I think it's really important when you're editing images to always have a really clear idea of where you're going to take the editing process, so you're not just sliding around randomly trying to do what looks good. And I think what I like about this image and what's important is it's all about the way that the light hits the peaks. That's where the drama of the image is. There's nothing really happening in the sky. So that's what I'm going to focus on in the editing process, trying to bring that out as much as possible. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just to increase the highlights and the whites just a little bit, which is just going to kind of push out that light even more. And I think I'm also going to change the color temperature. I'm just going to increase the temperature because it's a little bit blue, so I'm just going to warm it up to something around about 6,500 just to give the whole image a bit more warmth, and perhaps also just increase the tint a little bit just to introduce a little bit of magenta into the image. Now, I want to further enhance the way that the light's hitting the peaks. What I'm going to do is use a couple of radial filters. So I just put a radial filter across here, across where the light's hitting the peak. Just shift that around to fit and reset those settings. And what I'm going to do in the radial filter is just brighten it up a little bit. So just a tiny bit of exposure, around about 9 or 10. And also push out the highlights again just a little bit, not too much, or it's going to look really obvious. And I'm also going to just so it's a little bit warmer, I'm just going to introduce a tiny bit of color temperature there, something like that, just to make the light a little bit warmer, just to really increase the warmth of the light hitting the peaks. And then I'm going to duplicate that and drop the duplicate radial filter on these peaks down here, so they both have a similar amount of adjustments to them. Okay, that's that. Now what I'm going to do to try to focus the eye on this is bring in a gradient filter here, and basically just do a little bit of vignetting just to darken the bottom of this image. By darkening the image, what that's going to do is just to pull your eye into the important part of the image, into the focal point around here. Our eyes tend to just skip across darkness, so what I will do is just reduce the exposure of that there. And I'm also going to put another radial filter in the top here. Let's just clear that. So I'll darken this down a little bit more, but what I'm also going to do is to take away some of that yellow in the sky and to cool the sky down a little bit. So I just pull that down to about 20, introduce a little bit more blue in the sky, and just push out the highlights where the radial filter is going across the peaks. There, and that also just gives the sky just a little bit more pop. So what you can see now is by darkening the top and the bottom and really bringing out the light on the peaks, it's made the whole image a lot more focused, so our eyes just automatically go to the light on the peaks here. I think what I'm also going to do is I don't want to touch the saturation, but I'm going to increase the vibrance a little bit to something around 10, and also the clarity just to give me a little bit more punch in the details there. So just zoom in when I introduce clarity, just to make sure I'm not introducing any noise or any artifacts. That looks fine. And then the last thing I'm going to do is go down to the split toning here. What I want to do is just put a little bit of color into the highlights. So I'm going to ignore the shadows and just look at the highlights. And if I press Alt and then Hue, what that does is it gives me a full saturation version, which tells me what color I'm introducing into the highlights. I want it to be something warm, so I'm going to be looking at something around here, about that color. Now obviously saturation is set to 0, so it's not having any effect at all, so that's just telling me which color that I'm going to actually introduce. So I will just put the saturation up to something around about a little bit more than 10, less than 15, just to give me a little bit more of that orangey reddy warmth into the highlights on the peaks there. And that's pretty much it. I don't think the image needs anything more than that. What I would do is then
resize and sharpen that for the web upload. But it's a very simple image. It really doesn't need anything more special than that, anything more doing to it than that. Now the next image that I want to have a look at is this group of images here, which is a panorama that I took. Now it's not the one that I actually filmed myself taking, because when that happened there was still light in the sky. This was taken in the blue hour just after the sun had gone down, and you can see that there's actually quite a lot of, there's a really nice pink in the sky. It lacks the dramatic light of the previous image, but if that were the case I'd probably be editing it in a very similar way. So just to do something a little bit different, I'll have a go at looking at this panorama. Now what I'd like to do with this is actually have a look at editing it in Capture One, because I kind of use both for my processing. I use Lightroom and Capture One. I like them both. They've both got different advantages and disadvantages. And just so I'm not doing the same thing, what I'll do is edit this in Capture One. But what I can't do in that software is stitch the panorama. So I'm going to have to do that in Lightroom. So I just select them all, right click and go to Photo Merge Panorama. So this is just giving me a preview of the panorama. Perspective usually gives you something that looks a little bit weird, so generally all of my, I tend to go with spherical or cylindrical. Yep, that looks okay. And then I'll just hit merge and Lightroom will stitch it together. Okay, so now you can see that the panorama is finished. It's stitched it together. Lightroom does a really nice job with panoramas. You can see that there's no mark at all in the sky. It's all blended, so any vignetting in the individual images is taken care of and smoothed away. Just apologies for the noise the noise of my fan kicking in on my laptop, because when I'm screen recording and using Lightroom, then the fan kicks in to try to keep the temperature of the laptop down, because it's not a new laptop. It's about 5 years old and it's starting to show its age a little bit, so apologies for the background noise. Now what I'm going to do is edit this in Capture One. Okay, so here we are in Capture One. I'll just click import here and it's pointed out in the same folder, so there's the stitch pano, so I'll just import it like that and then open it. Now the way that Capture One works is that you're supposed to basically just work your way across the different tabs here when you do your processing. It doesn't really work for me. It's not something that I find particularly intuitive. So what I've done, because what you can do on Capture One is you can basically take all of these different things and stack them and arrange them how you like. So I've got pretty much everything that I use for editing stacked in the same sidebar here, in very much the same manner that you would see in Lightroom, because it just makes the switch between editing in both softwares a lot more clearer to me. So pretty much everything that I need is here. You can see the histogram, different layers going all the way down through the different exposure, white balance controls, etc., and then the color controls, and then things like sharpness and noise reduction at the bottom. So now looking at this image, it doesn't really need that much. There's really, it's very simple. There's not a lot of drama in the image. It's got a really lovely color palette. So I'm basically just going to be trying to enhance what's already there. Now you can see, because this was a DNG that was stitched together from the panorama in Lightroom, it's kind of brought it over with these with the edge here. It's not cropped it, and that doesn't matter. I could crop it here or just leave it and crop it when it gets back into Lightroom. What I'm going to do is just leave it, because it's just simpler that way, and work straight onto editing it. So the first thing that I need to do is, it looks a little bit darker in Capture One. It tends to render images slightly differently. So first I'm just going to increase the exposure a little bit, just about half a stop, somewhere around about there. And I'm also, because I really like the tones and I want to actually increase the coolness of it and increase the magenta, so I'm just going to have a look at the white balance, cool down the white balance a little bit and increase the tint. So just somewhere around about there I think is okay, and then increase the tint just a tiny amount to around about there, just to give me a slightly different, slightly more pleasing color palette to play with. I'm then going to go to this is where you find the highlights and shadows. As you can see, it's laid out slightly different to Lightroom, so I'm just going to increase the highlights just a little bit to somewhere around about 10, and the shadows as well, just to bring everything out a little bit. And then I'll go to levels. Now, because I often use whites and blacks, as you saw in the previous image, because we don't have whites and blacks In Capture One, basically we use the levels here with this slider on the highlight side affecting the whites, and then this slider on the shadow side affecting the blacks. Now I don't really want to touch the blacks. I'm just going to brighten up the shadows, the highlights a little bit. So I just pull that in just to make the snow pop a little bit more. Now I think the next thing I want to do is do some of the things that Capture One gives me the tools to do that I don't have in Lightroom. Now Capture One has layers, so what I'm going to do is go here to create a layer. So it's a long click and I go for a filled layer, and what I'm going to do is create a luminosity mask in Capture One. Now luminosity mask is basically a mask that works on a particular tone within the image, so you can be just applying adjustments just to the shadows or just to the highlights or just to the midtones. What I want to do is apply adjustments only to the snow. So what I do is I click on Luma Range here, and I'll just click on this button which allows me to see the mask. Because everything's gone red, that means everything's affected. But as I move these sliders here, what you'll see is that narrows down a little bit, and the bits that are red are basically the bits that are going to be affected by any adjustment that I make. And as I said, I want to pinpoint the snow a little bit, so I'm just going to slide this around. It's probably going to be a little bit brighter more to the bright side here, and just affect the snow. Yeah, something like that. Now the shadows, this slider's at the bottom. This kind of affects the fall off. It's how broad or narrow the selection is, so something like that, and I just click apply. Now because I'm working on this layer, all of these tools below here are now basically only working on this layer and only working on that area that I've just masked, which is the snow area. So again, because I just want to brighten the snow just a little bit, what I'm going to do is just come back down to levels again and just again pull this in. It's just going to brighten the snow just a little bit, and also the midtones of the snow here. So if I turn this off and on, you can see really it's just making that snow pop a little bit. Now with images taken in the blue hour, you really have to be careful with contrast. They shouldn't be too contrasty. It looks a little bit false. At this kind of time of day, this kind of shooting conditions, there really isn't a huge amount of contrast, so it's better not to push things too far. Now what I'm going to do is make another layer, because I want to work on the sky. Now I could just do this on the background, but I'd like to work with layers. It's the way that I work in Photoshop, and I think it's one of the nice things that Capture One gives you, is that you can work on separate layers which can be turned off and on. So I'm just going to create another layer there, fill layer, and then go to this tool which allows me to create a linear gradient mask. So this works very much in the same way that it does in Lightroom or in Photoshop. If I click M there, it shows me what's being masked, and I just want to mask the sky. So again, I'm going to go down to levels, but because I want to darken the sky, I'm going to pull the shadows in a little bit here, which is going to darken the darker parts of the sky. So it just needs to come in a tiny little bit to somewhere around about there. But I'm also going to brighten the brighter parts of the sky to stop it from looking too flat. So I just pull that down to about there, and we can see the effect that we've had. It just gives the sky a little bit more punch, a little bit more depth. And to finish, I'm going to go back to the background layer and do some more adjustments on here. I'm just going to push the shadows out a little bit more, which is here in the high dynamic range. And the reason I'm doing this is actually just to reduce the contrast, because I think it's looking a little bit contrasty around here. So I just push that out to somewhere around about here. And now I'm going to work on the detail. So we'll just zoom in to 100%. And just introduce a little bit of clarity. Don't need too much. I find Capture One already introduces plenty of detail into the image as well. Now what I'm going to do is go down to the color editor. Now this is something that is really powerful in Capture One. It has a really strong color editor because it's really nice to play with the colors here. You can see I've got this color wheel which is kind of split up, so I've got these controls for the different smoothness, hue, saturation, lightness for the different aspects of the color wheel. Now this part of the color wheel here is actually already selecting the sky, which is the area that I want to work on. And what I want to do is to make that less warm, to make it less orangey and a little bit cooler and more magenta. So I'm going to look at the hue control here. Now you can see this basically is just controlling the hue within these tones in the color wheel. So the more I go that way, the more it goes this way to the color wheel, which is orangey. And as I go that way, it takes the hue in this direction to the bluer part of the color wheel. So I'm just going to go down there to somewhere like that, just to give it a little bit more magenta, a little bit bluer. And then I'm just going to increase the saturation of that to somewhere like there. Okay, and the final thing is sharpening. Now for sharpening, I should always zoom in to 100% so I can see what I'm working on. I'll just get the navigator tool there so I can move around the image. And if I left click here, it actually gives me quite a few sharpening presets. And I find that this soft image sharpening works really quite nicely. You can see that I actually get a preview on the image as I scroll through them, but this soft image sharpening one works really quite nicely. If I move around, I can see, looking at the edges here, that there aren't any halos at all. If I go up into the sky, I'm not seeing any noise, which would be a sign that it's being over sharpened. Now, if I really wanted to work on this, and if I were probably taking more time, I'd basically just paint on with a brush the areas that I want to sharpen, which is mostly around these cliffs here, because the sky never needs sharpening, and neither does this snow really. But because this is just basically a quick and nasty process, just doing it as quickly as I possibly can for the video, I think that looks okay. I'm quite happy with that setting. And that is pretty much it for the image. I don't think it needs any more than that. It's very subtle. I didn't want to really change the feel of the image very much. And what I would do now in Capture One is go over here to the process, and you can see that I've got a process, calls it here a recipe, but it's just the same as the export presets that you have in Lightroom. And you can see that I've got it as a full resolution TIFF, and it's going to a particular folder here. If I click process, it's going to basically export this as a full resolution TIFF to that folder. Okay, now that's done. So what I'm going to do is close Capture One and go back to Lightroom. And back in Lightroom, you can see the image here, and I've got this folder, Capture One Images, which is set up to auto-import any images which Capture One exports to a particular folder. So the image has kind of done a circle and come right back into Lightroom. Now all I've got to do is just drag it and drop it into the original folder, and you can see that it appears here alongside all the original raw files that I made the panorama with. Well, okay, that's it for this video. I hope it's been interesting and hope it's been useful. If there's anything at all, anything that you'd like to know, just drop me a comment in the comments box below or send me an email. And until the next time, thanks for watching and take care.